Hey guys, it's Jackie. Welcome back to my channel. So it's time for my April wrap-up. It is past due time for my April wrap-up since this is now probably getting uploaded on like June. Wow, my brain is like just shooting far ahead. Is being uploaded on like May, probably 5th, I'm gonna probably guess. But I wanted to go ahead and do my April wrap-up because April was actually a super productive reading month for me. Probably because of the quarantine, coupled with, you know, some good old-fashioned shirking of my actual responsibilities, just a hair. But I was able to get quite a few books read this month, which is really great because this month's reading challenge, I took my my O.W.L.s through Book Roast's Magical Readathon, which is something I do every year. This is the first year I've done it while having a Booktube channel. So it was kind of important to me to actually finish the challenge this time, which I did. I chose this year Hogwarts Professor because it seemed like, you know, the closest to what my actual career path is at the moment, and I thought it would be kind of fun and also just give me the most opportunity for books I need to read for my dissertation TBR anyway. So the first book prompt that I needed to complete in order to become a Hogwarts professor is that you have to complete the exam in a subject that you wish to teach, and I chose History of Magic because I felt like, again, it's kind of the closest to what I actually do in life. Like, I'm writing a dissertation that is about fantasy. So I write about, you know, magical creatures and fantasy for a living anyway, so History of Magic seemed kind of like a funny fit to me. And the prompt for History of Magic was a book featuring witches or wizards. And for this one, I went with Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas. And this is a forthcoming book. It was supposed to be published, I believe either this month, May, or in the beginning of June, like June 3rd or something like that. It has now been pushed back to September 1st of this year because of COVID-19, which I'm sad about because I really want a physical copy of this book, but also I totally understand and also don't totally mind just because this is such an autumny read, honestly, that I feel like it kind of fits a September release better than it did a May release, but you know, maybe that's just me. Cemetery Boys was one of my most anticipated new releases of this year. I've been looking forward to reading that book like since the moment I saw that this book existed. And when I was approved for an e-arc on NetGalley, I was so excited, and I have to say, it did not disappoint at all. I gave it 5 stars. I loved this book so much. Oh my gosh. So Cemetery Boys is about a young Latino brujo, Yadriel, who is growing up in East LA as part of this large coven of bruex who their magic kind of operates under sort of, I have my hand here, sort of gender essentialist terms that there are brujos and brujas, but they have different powers depending on, you know, your gender. That brujas, so witches, can, even though he doesn't like the word witch, female witches can heal things. Whereas brujos can commune with the dead, they can summon spirits, they can raise the dead. In ancient times, they were able to resurrect the dead. It's just two totally different forms of magic based on your gender identity. And Yadriel is gay and trans. He is a trans boy. And he is trying to get his family to accept him into the community as a brujo, not a bruja. He wants to be a brujo and have his quince and, you know, go under the sacred rites as a brujo, because I am a boy and I am not good at healing magic. I am good at communing with the dead because I'm a boy. And his family and community not really totally accepting that and not wanting him to undergo the sacred rites as a boy. They think that that's going to be some kind of aberration or that the gods won't accept it. And so Yadriel decides to embark on performing these sacred rites for himself. That if you guys won't let me do this, I will do this for myself and commune with Lady Death myself. And his cousin goes missing, and in an effort to try to find his cousin, he accidentally summons the spirit of a former classmate, Julian, who has also disappeared, well, died under mysterious circumstances. And so it turns into a kind of murder mystery of now Yadriel and Julian and his other cousin Maritza trying to solve what happened to Julian, who does not remember his death, only that it was violent, and what happened to their cousin Miguel, and become kind of bound up in this supernatural murder mystery plot. And the problem for Yadriel is, of course, that Julian is kind of cute, and sparks fly, and it's so good. Aidan Thomas is an Own Voices author, which is so clear in this book. It does such a good job with using this system of magic as an analogy for gender essentialism, and talking about being a brujo as like an analogy for being a trans boy. It gets all of the really broad strokes right, but then there's also so much about like transphobic microaggressions in this book. It's such an interesting read, and it's interesting not just because of the excellent trans rep, but also the excellent Latinx rep. That, again, this takes place in East LA. I think all of the characters are Latinx. I think all of them. Yadriel, I believe, he's Mexican, but one of his grandmas is Cuban. And all of the rituals that Yadriel's family perform all kind of circulate around Dia de los Muertos. So it is drawing on Dia de los Muertos, but also like Mesoamerican mythology, which I thought was very interesting. There's a lot of like talk about like Xibalba, like the spirit world, and it was it's just a fascinating kind of contemporary take on Mesoamerican mythology and something like Dia de los Muertos, and its spiritual importance, while also telling this really excellent and interesting story about, gender and acceptance and family and found family. It was just like, mwah. And the romance is so good. I loved it so much. I can't recommend it enough. It comes out in September. Again, it's an excellent autumn read, or will be an excellent autumn read. It's all about, Halloween and Dia de los Muertos and cemeteries, as the title implies, and spirits. And again, the protagonist is really likable. It's funny. It has a kind of gut-wrenching twist that I did see coming, but that it was narratively satisfying. So I'm like, good. It reminds me so much of The Witch Boy by Molly Ostertag. So much of The Witch Boy, but with much more complex world building. So if you like something like The Witch Boy, or are interested in, narratives about queerness and magic being kind of analogies for each other, I can't recommend this book enough. I adored it. The next prompt was Defense Against the Dark Arts, which this required a book that was set at sea or on the coast, like on a beach, and for that I picked Songs from the Deep by Kelly Powell, which this one, I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this one. I did enjoy it. I gave it, I think 3 stars. It wasn't terrible. It's extremely atmospheric, and immediately kind of digs its claws into you and pulls you along, I guess down under into this world, which I really, really appreciated about it. The narrative, though, just kind of, I don't know, it never really goes anywhere interesting. It was just kind of formulaic and predictable, and that was kind of frustrating. And so Songs from the Deep is about this small island town where sirens exist and kind of haunt the coasts of this island. And there are factions on the island, those that are kind of more conservationist, that believe that the sirens are like kind of any other animal and should just be left alone, versus people who think that the sirens are monsters and they're murderous and they're dangerous, which they are. They do sometimes kill tourists. It's like sharks, right? That it's like when you invade their territory, sharks will attack or can attack. Does that necessarily justify then going out and hunting them to extinction? No. So there is definitely an analogy here to be said for that, which I did find, as someone who grew up on a beach, very, very interesting. And so what ends up happening, which no spoilers again, is that our protagonist, Moira Alexander, whose father had a special connection or interest in the sirens, she becomes determined to solve what she sees as a murder mystery. A young boy turns up dead on the beach. Everyone in the town assumes it was the sirens who did it, and Moira is like, that doesn't make sense. the wounds on his body are too clean to be siren claws. Like, clearly he was murdered, and it was set up to make it look like the sirens attacked. So she and her best friend go about trying to solve this murder mystery and figure out who is actually behind this child's death, and try to kind of work out like what political machinations underlie this death, and who gains to benefit from framing the sirens, you know, politically. So it's very interesting premise, right? And I enjoyed most of it. It is a good mystery. It is atmospheric, but again, I don't know. It just never, I just never got any kind of like real narrative satisfaction out of this. It just kind of meanders. Like, the second half of it is just sort of predictable, and like when we find out who is responsible, it's kind of like, yeah, that makes sense. And then just things kind of wrap up a little too neatly, and I don't know. Again, nice book. I'm probably going to pass this one along to someone else who would like it. But 3 out of 5 stars. So the next prompt, which for Hogwarts Professor, once you do the 2 required topics, which for me were, again, History of Magic and Defense Against the Dark Arts, you then have to choose 5 additional subjects. So you get to choose 5 prompts that you want to do. And my first one was arithmancy, which the prompt for arithmancy was something outside of your favorite genre. And for that, I chose Serpent and Dove, because I had a suspicion that I probably would not like this book. It just didn't seem like the kind of thing that I would be super into. And I was right. I really didn't like this book. I really didn't like this book at all. Hilariously, I did not like Serpent and Dove, not for the reasons I expected to dislike Serpent and Dove. I thought I would dislike Serpent and Dove, which is about a young witch who's kind of forced into a marriage with a witch hunter in order to protect herself. I thought I would hate it because of that romance. I thought that romance was probably going to be kind of ick. And honestly, that was not my problem with this book. The romance was actually kind of cute. The characters had great chemistry. They have great banter. If they were in any other book or any other scenario, I would ship this. Like Louise and Reed, I like them. I think they're interesting. It's all very Taming of the Shrew, where like he's just like, you know, Edward Cullen levels of just like uptight, my virtue, and she's just like a raccoon child that he found in the trash, and she just antagonizes him all the time. And I kind of enjoy that dynamic, like a kind of Darcy and Elizabeth sort of vibe, but more feral. Like I like that. I really do. So that didn't totally bother me. However, when I remembered the actual context of this relationship, then I did get really uncomfortable. Because Serpent and Dove is fundamentally about, again, it's about witchcraft in the 17th century, kind of. And again, he's a witch hunter, so he wants to exterminate people like her. And so it's kind of icky when she then, you know, like slowly falls in love with him, and it's kind of just like, comfortable with that after which he unlearns a lot of toxic things, obviously. Like, he's been indoctrinated into a system to believe that witches are evil. Here's the problem. buckle in, because I did not like this book. My problem with Serpent and Dove is that the world building is, for me, very poorly developed. And when I say that, what I mean is, I really wish this book had either decided to be 17th century historical fiction or fantasy set in a totally separate world from ours, which you can hybridize those very well, right? You know, something like A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. And I think that Serpent and Dove could have been interesting if it had just kind of committed to its fantasy setting, because it kind of does, but not totally. And I'll say more about that in just a second. Alternatively, it would have made a really interesting historical fiction, historical fantasy, where it's just set in 17th century Europe, which clearly it is. Because, among other things, like, it's just the Catholic Church. Like, there are two opposites. So we have a diametric opposition set up in this book between the witches and the church. And the church is clearly just the Catholic Church. And you know it's just the Catholic Church because they talk about God and Jesus and the Holy Trinity. So this is Christianity. This is just the Catholic Church, which is what really bothers me about this book. Because the witchcraft in this book is not a 17th century conception of witchcraft at all. It is not how the church in the 17th century would have understood witchcraft. It is not how practitioners of witchcraft in the 17th century would have understood witchcraft. Instead, the witchcraft here is a kind of bastardized version of contemporary Wicca, which if you don't know, Wicca is a very, very, very contemporary religion. It is based on a lot of, belief systems and pagan rites and practices that are obviously millennia old, but it is a Reconstructionist religion, and a lot of Wiccans are kind of eclectic, and they're just kind of like pulling from all sorts of periods of history to create something different, to create a way of worshiping or a way of living that is uniquely theirs and uniquely pagan, right? It is a recent religion, though. It is only about 100 years old. And so it was strange for me at various points of this book to have this very kind of 17th century Europe with a 17th century Catholic Church, because again, this is the Catholic Church. This is not a fantasy church. This is ridiculous. Versus what felt like a very kind of, again, bastardized form of Wicca through the eyes of a writer who clearly, I don't think, understands a lot about witchcraft as a practice or about Wicca. Like, the witches in this book feel like Shelby Mahurin watched The Craft one time. Which, that said, the fundamental problem in this book for me was that the witches in it are awful. Which is strange, right? That Louise, our heroine, who is a witch, is fleeing from her coven, fleeing from her mother and family, because the witches in this are genuinely a bunch of murderous, man-hating, baby-killing, licentious nightmare women, which, in a feminist reclamation of witchcraft, it's kind of a hard sell when you have the church in this book who is like, the witches are a bunch of murderous nightmare women, and then they actually are. Like, every negative, anti-feminist, straw man, anti-witchcraft stereotype you could come up with, that is the witches in this book. And it is so confusing to me. I don't get what the point of this book is. I don't understand what this book is trying to do. It's deeply uncomfortable for me reading it. I was so annoyed at various points. Because the other thing that is so weird, which Jesse over at Bowties and Books did an excellent video about this subject called Serpent Dove Wasted My Time, which same, to be honest, and talked about the really troubling racial dynamics in this book and how the white characters' physical features are always so lovingly described, and then the characters of color are kind of glanced over. But also there were just so many moments in this book where it felt like Shelby Mahurin, and again, I'm not trying to talk trash about Shelby Mahurin necessarily. I don't know a lot about her or, what she did her degree in, or if she knows a lot about 17th century history. Maybe she does. I don't know. But there were a lot of moments in this book where I just felt like there was some language used or analogies being used that felt kind of inappropriate to me. The one that really bothered me, because it came up a few times, was that there is a character in this book who is a witch, and we don't know her name initially, and so Lou keeps referring to her as the hook-nosed woman, and then hook nose. Here's the thing. There's a reason why we don't use hook nose and hook nosed as epithets anymore, because you're not likely to see them outside of anti-Semitic screeds on Reddit. Like, it's just not, you just have to find alternate ways of describing this character, and definitely not use Hook-Nose as, again, an epithet, a way of, you know, describing the character, that she becomes Hook-Nose the Witch, because, again, the history of 17th century witchcraft and its intersection with anti-Semitism in Western Europe during the same period, that is a long, fraught, and ugly history, and so it was uncomfortable to me to be reading this book that is obviously about 17th century witchcraft, and then to have characters described as, like, the Hook-Nose. And again, it's all about, like, the church wanting to commit genocide against the witches, and then Lou, who is passing as, like, you know, Reed doesn't know she's a witch, falling in love with him while he, you know, supports this genocide against her people. It was all very kind of, like, I feel like in different hands, this could have been a more interesting look at, like, again, things like religious persecution and passing, because the analogy clearly here is about, like, Jewishness or, you know, Romani identity. And I can't help but think of, like, Anna Marie McLemore's Dark and Deepest Dread, which I enjoyed very much, which is a historical fantasy that does this so much better and reclaims witch as a feminist state of being so much better than this book does. This book is white feminism, the book. Like, this book's idea of feminism is that, you know, what would be cool is white ladies having sex and getting to enjoy it with their husbands. Okay, that's great, Lou. Like, Lou is very sexually liberated. That's nice. Except, you know, she shames sex workers constantly in this book, like, in really disparaging, nasty terms, which I'm just like, okay, the feminist message of this book is totally lost on me. Also really strange, again, is the witches are so terrible in this book. They are so terrible, and they're split into two contingents. There are les dames blanches, so the white ladies, and les dames rouges, the red ladies. And the white ladies have, like, a reed of ethics, so it's similar, again, to the Wiccan reed, where it's like, you know, that anything you put out into the universe will return to you triple fold. That, you know, that magic always has a cost, it has a price, which I thought that was kind of interesting. I think the system of magic here is fascinating. Again, but it's such a weird bastardized form of Wicca. I literally got so, like, incoherent with irritation that I had to, like, stop this video and take a moment because I got so mad. So there's the white ladies, who, again, have a kind of Wiccan reed, and then there are the red ladies who do blood magic and don't have a reed and are considered to be the more, like, savage form of magic. So you literally have the white ladies and the savage red ladies, and it's just like... And again, I would love to give Shelby Mahurin credit and say that this was all, like, a conscious anti-racist critique, that understands imperialism, but I don't think she does, because, like, the white lady's beef is all about how, like, we're going to reclaim our land back from these Christians. Like, they're just Christians. This is the Catholic Church. That we're going to reclaim our land back from the church. And so it becomes about, like, that their beef is all about indigeneity, except... I didn't like this book. Again, there are so many things and threads here that this could have been so interesting and smart, but it just falls totally flat because it just falls into a very kind of formulaic YA star-crossed lovers trap. And one of the most frustrating things for me, which is also something that Bow Ties and Books talked about, is that the characters here are so poorly developed. Not Reed and Lou. Again, weirdly, the thing I thought I would not like about this book is the thing I liked the best. The villains. The villains are such uninteresting, one-dimensional straw men. Where, again, you have the head of the Catholic Church, I'm just going to keep calling it the Catholic Church, the head of the Catholic Church, who is just a parody of everything that you would imagine, like, the head of the Catholic Church to be, that he's just so explicitly anti-feminist, it's just really hilarious, and he's, like, not even trying to pretend that that killing the witches isn't about, like, woman hating, which is really funny to me. Just such a parody. And then the head of the witches, the Grand High Witch, or whatever the hell she's called, who is such a parody of, again, everything the church thought witches were. That she's, like, a straw angry feminist, and I'm just like, I don't get what this book is trying to do. It's weird. It's like this book is like setting up like religious extremism versus like this feminist straw man, and like the middle ground here is clearly Reed and Lou having their conjugal marital bliss, and it's just kind of like, this book is white feminist, y'all, and I did not like it. I need to move on because I'm getting so heated. If you want an excellent review of this book that is more in depth, then I am willing to give this book anymore because I'm sick of talking about it already. I highly recommend Jesse's review because it is so good. It is so on point. It is so funny. I totally agree. Like, this book also wasted my time, and I will be passing it along. And I'm going to take it down before I think of other points that I had. Because I read this book first. And so I read it at the beginning of the month. And trust me, I had like a whole list of things that pissed me off about this book. But I'm just going to move on. The plot is predictable. I guessed every twist in this book. I hated this book. I gave it 2 stars. And I gave it 2 stars just because I did like Lou and Reed's banter. I wish they were in another book. Because I enjoyed them. I was entertained. It was like, again, if Edward Cullen and Bella got together, but Bella was like a feral raccoon woman, like just an absolute disaster, antagonizing the hell out of him, and that's kind of fun to me. All right, okay, moving on to my next subject. So we're going to go from a book that I did not like to a book that I did like very much. So my next subject was astronomy, and the prompt for astronomy was a book that you are supposed to read at night. So it could be any book, it's just that you need to read it at night. So for this one, I read a book that I have been meaning to get to forever, which is Shauna Maguire's Down Among the Sticks and Bones. This is the second book in the Wayward Children series. This is a book, as you can tell from my tabbies, that I did need to go ahead and read for my dissertation. I'm writing a chapter right now about like the queer undead and vampires and zombies and ghouls and ghosts as analogies for queerness. So this book was too good to pass up. If you're not familiar with the Wayward Children series, which I feel like everyone on Booktube is at this point, it's a series of portal fantasy novels about children finding doors into other worlds and becoming kind of integrated into those worlds in various ways, and then all having to, like, they all find their way back to the human world, but are not adjusting well. They're all deeply traumatized, and a lot of them want to go back to the fantasy portal worlds from which they spent all this time, from which they came, is what I meant to say. So the first novel in the Wayward Children series is about all of these different characters at this boarding school where they've all been put because their parents don't know how to handle their trauma. You know, my child came back after 4 years. She was missing for 4 years and is suddenly talking about, like, you know, vampires and werewolves, or, you know, that he was in the Fae realm and all of this other wild stuff, and they cannot cope with it. So they dump them at this boarding school, and they have to solve a murder mystery. I like murder mysteries. Is that not obvious here? Down Among the Sticks and Bones is the second book, and this is a kind of prequel. A lot of the books are prequels, so the characters we meet in the first book, we then get to see their adventures in their respective portal worlds. And this is the book that is about my favorite characters from the first book, Jack and Jill. The twins. I love Jack. Jack is my favorite character in this. And Jack and Jill are, they're a pair of twins who are born to just the most awful, Dursley-esque, just heinous parents who had children just because having children is what you're supposed to do. And they really wanted a boy and a girl, and they got 2 twin girls instead. And so the parents then set about deciding that, like, okay, well, we're going to make one of our daughters really hyper feminine, and we're going to make one of them really hyper masculine. She's going to be a tomboy, whether she likes it or not. And just about, it's again about the way we gender children and force children into gender roles that they don't get to choose. And so that was really fascinating. And the girls grow up and they're not really happy. And then one day when they're 12, a portal in their attic opens and they go into the moors. And so their portal world is this gothic nightmare world full of monsters, full of vampires and sea creatures and mad scientists and werewolves. And I found it really fascinating, and I'm writing about it in my dissertation because they each respectively quickly integrate themselves into this new landscape and finally are able to be themselves. Like, Jack, who was always Jacqueline, and you have to be super feminine and wear dresses even though you don't really like dresses, she is able in this space to kind of carve out a niche for herself as like a mad scientist assistant, and you know, and she's queer, and like, and you can be queer in this space. Whereas Jill, who was always forced to be a tomboy even though she didn't want to be a tomboy, she becomes like this vampire master's daughter lover. It's creepy, where she gets to wear beautiful diaphanous gowns and be a princess, and they just kind of get to live their fantasies. And obviously it's like, this is going to have a cost, because becoming a vampire's daughter lover is, you know, that rarely works out. Sorry, Bella, but like that rarely works out. And so it's an interesting prequel about Jack and Jill and their time in the moors. And again, I really like it because it's interesting to me to have this space of horror, like ostensible horror, be a space where you can, these children were free to just be themselves for a change. They were free to express their gender identities and their sexual identities in a way that they've never been able to before. And I really love that about this book. So I gave this book 5 stars. I love it. Shauna Maguire's writing is so lyrical, and the Wayward Children series are such beautifully crafted little dark fairy tales that just love. So after the very negative review I just gave this one, I really loved this book. Okay, the next prompt was Care of Magical Creatures, which was, I think, yeah, creature with a beak on the cover. So I read Adam Silvera's Infinity Sun for this, which this one, I would kind of middling. It was fine. I was really intrigued to see like Silvera write a fantasy novel. This is his first fantasy novel, as I understand it. And I was drawn in, whoa, that is like on fire, which is appropriate. It's a phoenix. I was drawn in because the premise is about like 2 brothers who are like polar opposites of each other. And again, I like books about siblings who are kind of diametric opposites in that way. And I think that's really interesting. But this book just, I don't know. I didn't really care for it that much. I did really like the main character, but the fantasy world building and the plot are just kind of all over the place and not really well developed. It's just not, it felt like a really like, again, say what you want about Cassie Clare's prose, because her prose is, I'm sorry, not great, and I do struggle with it at times. I do think Cassie Clare's world building is very good. I just do. I think that it's extraordinarily well developed. It's very well crafted and well thought out. It's a much more diverse and interesting setting than even like the wizarding world, I think. Infinity Sun felt like the Mortal Instruments without any world building, though. That we're just kind of thrown into this world where we're expected to kind of keep our heads above water and understand like what's going on and what these magical creatures are and who all of these people are, and it just doesn't work. So the basic premise of this novel is that we have 2 brothers, Brighton and Emil, and they're both Latinx, they're both Latino. Again, Emil is gay, so again, there's a lot of queer Latino rep in these books, and I loved him. Emil was baby. I did really like Emil. Emil and Brighton, and they live in a kind of urban fantasy version of New York City, but there are these things called Celestials, who are kind of like X-Men mutants who have special powers. Again, I read the book and I don't fully understand like where the powers came from or like why they have the powers. And then there's spellwalkers, who are people who kind of are like shadow hunters, basically. So it's again very similar to the Mortal Instruments. And Brighton and Emil get kind of drawn into this world. Brighton really wants to be a spellwalker. He wants to have these special abilities so badly. And Emil really wants nothing to do with it. Emil just wants to, you know, like go to his job at the museum and talk about phoenixes and like maybe kiss a boy or something. Like he's not interested in this at all. And so of course on their 18th birthday it's Emil who develops the special abilities and not Brighton. And so that becomes a source of tension between the 2 brothers, and Emil becomes like a kind of, again, it's the chosen one narrative, but kind of deconstructed, although I would argue not deconstructed enough to make this interesting. And again, they get pulled into this shadowy kind of underworld full of magical creatures and spellwalkers and shadow hunters, basically. Again, I liked Emil very much. I was totally disappointed with the dynamic between the two brothers. Again, they're always talking about how much like, oh, we love each other. We fight all the time, but we love each other, but we don't really get to see that much. We're just told constantly. And again, the world building here just... There was just parts of this where I just wanted to skim. I just was so not interested in the fantasy elements of this book, like, at all. And again, the Chosen One narrative is present here, and I think it's clear Silvera is trying to deconstruct it, but it's not deconstructed enough. It's still played too straight. So it just kind of is uninteresting. Which again, a fantasy novel and just in which we had like a gay Latino chosen one alone should be enough to kind of propel me through this. And that's why I finished the book, but the plot just didn't do it for me. And again, it has something that I've complained about in previous videos on this channel. It ends so abruptly with such flagrant sequel bait that annoyed me. Again, I don't mind sequel bait. I feel like a fantasy series, you're going to have a little bit of sequel bait at the end, obviously, but again, you still need to tell an enclosed narrative, and this book I don't feel does. Like, nothing is really resolved by the end of this book. Like, even the interpersonal conflicts are not resolved at all by the end of this book. Not even like, oh, like grudgingly, no. And again, like, there is a male-male romance in it that I was most invested in that, but that doesn't show up till like so late in the book, and I don't think I'm going to read the sequel. I just did not. I just didn't care enough. So I gave this one 3 stars. The next one is such a strange book. This is Jennifer Giesbrecht's The Monster of Elendhaven. And I read this one for the Potions prompt, which was a book shorter than 150 pages. This is 150 pages exactly. And I was so glad because I'd been meaning to read this for a minute. Because I knew it was a book that my trash behind was going to love. And I did. I really liked it. It was exactly the kind of like queer, gothic, monster couple trash that I really enjoy, as you can see, like all my dark academic books, like dark academia, like mad scientist just feels like I liked this book a lot. And I knew I would, which this is a dark fairy tale set in an industrial city in the Arctic North. I mean, it's a fantasy version of the Arctic North, and it's like the city that's like surrounded by pollution. And it's about this young, well, not young at this point, but he's found as a young boy and doesn't remember what his name is. He's treated as a monster, and he becomes like a serial killer and is roaming the streets, and he's called the Monster of Elendhaven. And he meets this dandy fop rich boy, and immediately there's like a connection between the two of them, and the dandy fop turns out to be like a mad scientist, so it becomes like serial killer / mad scientist romance. And it's queer and gothic and a black comedy and so dark, and like if you like things like Hannibal or Gotham, I think you will enjoy this. It reminds me, I think probably most of Patrick Susskind's Perfume, which is an excellent novel, really dark, and a very interesting film. They made an interesting little film adaptation of it with I think Ben Whishaw. And that's the kind of vibe this gave me. Just so strange. It understands the gothic genre so well. And yeah, it gave me everything that I wanted it to. Like, it checked off every box that I expected it to. So I enjoyed this one a lot. I gave it 4 stars. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a perfect read, like an absolute love, but it was really good. So loved this one. The next book on my list is for Transfiguration, which is a book that contains shape-shifting or shapeshifters. And for that I chose Lobizona, by Romina Garber, which has such a beautiful cover. Like, such a beautiful cover. And this is a book I was also meaning to read, kind of peripherally for my disc, even though my werewolf chapter is already written. But this is about Argentinian werewolves and being an illegal immigrant in the United States. And again, making analogies between being treated as a monster and not belonging as like a werewolf, but also being treated as a monster and never feeling like you belong as an illegal alien, and living under this constant fear of, violence. ICE figures really prominently in this book, and it's an intensely political book, which I appreciated. It's unflinchingly political and just unflinchingly about things like Trumpism and violence against illegal immigrants and dehumanization of illegal immigrants. And It's written in this very kind of dreamlike magical realist style, which I thought was interesting. Like there's a lot of meta references in this book to like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but there's also a lot of meta references to Harry Potter, which I'll get to in just a second, which I thought was interesting. Because this book, the first quarter of it kind of feels almost like a contemporary novel. Like this feels like a contemporary issues novel about, you know, this Argentinian girl and her mother who are living illegally in Miami, and her mother gets taken by ICE, and now she has to figure out how to save her mom. With the twist now that like it's a magical realist novel, and our main character Manu is actually a Lobizona. She's a werewolf, and has to try to figure out like, okay, my mom's been taken by ICE. I am a werewolf. I'm gonna try to find my dad because maybe my dad is the key to all of this. And then embarks on this journey and comes across this coven of Septimuses, they're called, because it's like, it's this Argentinian folklore, if I'm not mistaken, about like how like the 7th son in a family will be born a werewolf and the 7th daughter will be born a bruja. So they're, again, it's this very interesting like gender essentialist construction of magic where it's like boys are werewolves and girls are witches. Girls heal and boys protect. And that's very interesting because Manu is a werewolf. She's not a witch. And so she's trying to figure out like, well, why am I a werewolf? Which the answer sadly here is not queer. Like it's not like a queer novel, which bummed me out, but it's totally fine. I think it's interesting that there's been so many books recently about like forms of like using magic as an analogy for gender essentialism and gender roles. And I think that's really intriguing, and it's something that I might mention Lobizona in my diss at some point, just to kind of, as a comparison to something like Cemetery Boys and The Witch Boy, because it's operating like with the same kind of fantasy framework. That said, Lobizona, I gave it 4 stars just because I enjoyed the prose so much. The story, I'm so gripped for like the first quarter of the book, but then once we get into the more fantasy world elements, it's not that it falls apart, it's just that it's not super interesting, especially compared to, because like the magic system is so similar to that of Cemetery Boys, and so I had like these 2 books back to back as comparisons to each other, and I just think Cemetery Boys' world building and system of magic is more interesting than Lobizona's. A lot of the fantasy elements here feel kind of, I don't know, glossed over, and it's just slow. It's really slow. This book could have benefited from being shorter, and I hate saying that, but genuinely, it takes so long for the plot to get started, which I don't mind. I like the slow burn first quarter, but then the plot, there's just so much I wanted to skim about her, like, playing soccer with the other werewolf boy. It's just, which I get it, because again, there's a lot of meta references to like Harry Potter, where like this is a deconstruction of like that Manu understands it, like, you know, oh, I've always dreamed of, you know, being sucked into a fantasy world because my life is so uninteresting, just like Harry Potter, that I'm gonna go to this magical school and learn all of these fun, interesting things. Which I really wish there had been more explicit acknowledgement, because like the magical world here is kind of terrible. That Manu does not find the solace and home that she was hoping she would find. She finds friends, but the place itself is kind of awful, and the system of magic is pretty awful. Which I wish there was more explicit acknowledgement of the fact that like that's also the case in Harry Potter, right? That like Harry finds friends, but Hogwarts and the Wizarding World are kind of heinous. Like they're pretty terrible places to be, and I wouldn't want to go there if you paid me. But anyway, so it is a good read. I do recommend it. If you like magical realism, I would definitely check this out. If you're interested in, again, contemporary fantasy novels and urban fantasy that are directly tackling political issues, this is a fascinating read. If you're looking for like a really well-developed like fantasy adventure, this one's kind of slow burn. I don't know, the fantasy elements to me are the least interesting part of this book. So I did manage to also complete the bonus certificates that I had planned on completing for this reading challenge. So this year in the Magical Readathon, you could do, again, your career path, but then also add on like little like bonus certificates, like little bonus degrees if you read a certain combination of prompts. And I thought that was really cute and fun. So I did a couple. So I did do the Animagus training, which required arithmancy, potions, and transfiguration. And obviously I made sure that of the 5 subjects I chose, all of those were included. So I did do those. And then I also did do the Merpeople Linguistics certificate, which I thought was really cute and fun. And again, I grew up on a beach and I thought that would be neat. For that one, you had to do herbology as a subject, so I went ahead and did herbology on top of my career path. The prompt for herbology, in order to get the Merpeople Linguistics degree, was to read a book that starts with the letter M. And in my original video, when I talked about my TBR, I said I was going to read Mayhem, which is an e-arc, and I ultimately decided that I was just so burnt out on supernatural fiction for the time being that I wanted to just go with some nonfiction, which this is kind of accessible nonfiction I thought would be, I know, a quicker read, and it was. This is Monster, She Wrote, The Women Who Pioneered Horror and Speculative Fiction by Lisa Kroger and Melanie R. Anderson. And this is it's a nonfiction monograph about, as it says, the women who pioneered horror and spec fic. And it is a series of little mini biographies of women who made some kind of major contribution to horror, the Gothic, science fiction, or fantasy. And it's such interesting and important work because things like science fiction and horror in particular, but even fantasy, are so often seen as being like the academic domain of men, that men read these and men write these, and women don't really have a place in that authorship or that readership or those fandoms. And that is just flagrantly untrue, as this book is trying to argue that figures like Margaret Cavendish and Mary Shelley, are some of the very earliest pioneers of these genres, and that there has been a long lineage of women making major contributions to these genres since the 17th century. And so this book, I really enjoyed it. I appreciated that it's both academic but kind of glib and fun. So that makes it very accessible, which I think with a book like this, you want accessibility, because that's one of academia's biggest problems, is like the problem with accessibility, that academics write in such like impenetrable jargon. And this book doesn't do that. This book is fun. I'm actually going to assign pieces out of this book for my summer class that's coming up, which is going to be about Frankenstein. But so this is really fun and cute. I'm going to show you, because it's also like illustrated, which I loved. It goes through the entire history of horror. So we have like the founding mothers, like Margaret Cavendish and Anne Radcliffe and Mary Shelley, and then moves into like haunting tales, so like Victorian ghost stories, and then like more occult fiction in the late 19th and early 20th century, and then pulp fiction from the mid 20th century, and women authors who specialized in haunted house narratives, women who specialized in like paperback horror, like V.C. Andrews. I did appreciate how inclusive this book is. It is not just a bunch of white ladies, which was really nice. There is queer rep in this. And again, it includes genres that are denigrated even within the denigrated genre of like horror and sci-fi. So again, things like the paperback Gothic. So things, like Flowers in the Attic, but that it's like that's considered to be trash even by, aficionados of people who love horror, which is something that has always irritated me a lot. So I really liked this. The end has a couple like really short meta essays about the future of horror, or where it seems like horror is pointing. So it was useful. And again, I always appreciate accessible academic nonfiction. So that is all of the books now. And I'm still missing 2 because 2 of them were e-arcs. So that is all the books that I read for this year's Magical Readathon. It was a great success. I really enjoyed reading all of these. Finally checking some things off of my dissertation TBR was really nice. That said, I don't imagine May is going to be a super productive reading month for me, because I need to get a big chunk of my next chapter written, and I also start teaching next week online. We're totally teaching online, which is going to be interesting because I have not taught online before, especially not an upper level course. So it's going to be fun trying to teach students how to write over the internet. It's going to be a joy, I'm sure. So I don't expect I will have as productive a reading month next month as this month, and I'm not doing any reading challenges for that reason. But I'll still be checking in with you guys over the next few weeks, hopefully with some fun content for you guys, unboxings. I really want to do a tarot deck haul because I've been very irresponsible with money. I wanted to support some indie artists and went a little haywire. So I'd love to do an indie tarot deck haul. I would also really like to do, again, a couple book tags. Maybe the Dark Academia book tag. It seems, again, appropriate for me. But in the meantime, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.